This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Encountered with archive, the archive, and also with contemporary literature. So I'm from a literature department and always very suspicious of people who talk about interdisciplinarity. So quite a lot of, I know a lot of you from different knowledge regimes, different disciplines, which is really great. But I wanted to talk particularly about thinking through this issue from a literature perspective, which we can then open out, I think, as we go through. So I was very very aware as I was thinking about the contemporary, the issue of contemporary, that it was, 25 years ago, right now, that I was struggling with my MA dissertation, which was kind of on David Lynch. And I'd never worked on film before, having been a very traditional literary person. And I was just about to start a PhD on two very contemporary writers who were very, very active at that time, J.G. Ballard and Angela Carter. And of course, as soon as I started, Angela Carter died. Ballard was and the thing about this, I think, is quite often people talk about being overwhelmed by the amount of information that you have with working with contemporary writers, contemporary literature, contemporary culture perhaps. It was kind of the opposite problem in those days, was that Angela Carter you could work on Angela Carter as soon as she died. She became a very respectable person. In fact, the AHRB as it was then, made an announcement 2 years after she died that they would no longer support any work on her because there was too much already. So she became a respectable figure. In other words, contemporary writers had to be dead for them to be, for you to be able to work on them in the archive. So Ballard is now respectable, obviously. And I was continually pushed while I was doing my PhD to tie Ballard to someone respectable and dead. So William Golding was often mentioning, you should sort of pair this with something. And there was actually a poverty of information rather than too much. So this is just before, I guess, the internet and that kind of way of researching. There were about 10 essays on J.G. Ballard that could be considered academic. The rest were in kind of semi-professional fanzine sort of areas that were in this penumbra that weren't really acceptable and incredibly difficult to get hold of as well. So that was it. And the kind of anxiety was that you didn't have a scholarly support for what it was that you were doing. And that might still be the case, but I think there is a very, very different attitude, actually, and many more avenues for people to do their research through that. The other issue, I think, is, and this is what I wanted to kind of investigate a little bit, was I really remember the profound, I think this is true of every single PhD student, there is a sense of profound anxiety about chasing the latest thing. It used to be the case that you would go to if you'd been up to the journals hall in Senate House, it was kind of a haunt of very, very anxious people, because what they were doing was they were looking at the latest journal things to see if their PhD had just been published by somebody. Because of course there were no alerts, there were no kind of sense of forthcoming stuff. It was you had to go and look at a group of 20-25 journals just to see what was coming out. And there is a kind of an anxiety about that. Where's the latest stuff? What do you mean you haven't heard of that? What do you mean you haven't read that? You're familiar with this kind of stuff. I think it's true of every PhD student who always thinks their PhD is about to be published by somebody else. But there is a particular kind of concern, I think, often expressed when people are working with contemporary writers and contemporary culture, that there's somehow a unique problem with working with contemporary literature. I don't know if, has Robert Eagleston's thing been mentioned? He wrote this sort of manifesto on contemporary literature in textual practice maybe two issues ago. What do you mean you haven't read it? And it was a sort of, towards a manifesto, I think it was called. And for Robert Eagleston, he's a literature person at Royal Holloway, he does argue that there's something very, very uniquely problematic about working in the contemporary. And that's to do, as he says, with the archive. We have, this is Robert Eagleston, we have in our subfield not only an open archive, but also an archive that is continuously proliferating and expanding. And for him, that's a unique problem, i.e. it's an open field, it's constantly shifting, it's constantly changing. I've taken him to task for that when he first delivered this, because I think a moment's thought would suggest that that is the condition of all archives. Every single archive is like that. All archives are open, all archives are unfinished. They're never closed, never complete. It relies on the fantasy of what I call the total archive, which is that thing in the X-Files, where all the secrets are. That sort of dream of plenitude. They're there somewhere. They're hidden away. You only need to find your way to them. That's where all the UFO information is and the alien abduction stuff is. So there's a kind of sense there of a problem about this. New things are always being discovered in old archives. New technologies are opening up archives in different kinds of ways. So if you work in the 19th century, for example, the whole field is being transformed by the digitisation of materials, newspaper materials and so on. The British Newspaper Archive keeps revealing another 1 million pages of stuff. It is infinite, literally, you can't contain it. But also newly searchable, and that does extraordinary things. So one of my students, James Mackin, working on weird fiction, for example, he's that generation now that you can just search on weird as a term in 19th century newspapers, and the whole genre changes because you can begin to see how much earlier it is being used in this particular kind of way than we thought. So that's a new technology that's opening up and transforming these sorts of things. The other thing about archives being incomplete is that, of course, archives, even more than universities, are massively underfunded, under-resourced, and they don't know what they've got usually. And actually they rely on researchers coming to them to ask specific questions that then force them, as it were, to catalogue what it is that they have. And that's, Birkbeck ran a day called Unlocking the Archive about 2 weeks ago, with a load of archivists from London Metropolitan Archive, which has a problem with storing 17,000 bodies in a warehouse on Regent's Canal. And they can't catalogue those. But I know from the British Museum just over there on the corner is building a new archive centre, because they're still cataloguing the stuff that arrived in about 1840, 1850. They literally don't know what they have. Under the road here is the stone storage, which comes towards us. There's a whole row of weird Egyptian things under the street heading right towards us right now. A whole row of seknets disappearing into the darkness, because I've been down there. All kinds of stuff. And when I was working on late 19th century, early 20th century materials, this is something that is really, really worth recognising about the archive, is that it's quite often the uncatalogued things that kind of emerge that are most interesting. Just as an example, when I started on this mummy project, which is kind of, it is very contemporary actually, very relevant now. But I was particularly interested in a case of a Victorian gentleman who everyone knew in London had been cursed by a mummy, and that's because he bought a mummy case and then probably shot his own arm off. And he was known as the one-armed cursed man, who actually had an enormous house in London, huge social circle, new artists, writers, politicians, imperialists, all kinds of people, Egyptologists and so on. And he was called Thomas Douglas Murray, and everyone knew him, everyone knew his story, but no one wrote it down. It was a gentleman's kind of agreement not to talk about this. So when I started the project, say 2002, 3, something like that, you put the name Thomas Douglas Murray into Google, that newfangled thing, and nothing really would come up. Archives, again, a few elements here and there would come up. And you would tug on those here and there. So I wasn't an archivist before this project, but actually became one by necessity. So, for example, 6 letters from Thomas Douglas Murray So he didn't have his writing arm shot off, that's good to know. In SOAS Special Collections. So you go to the SOAS Special Collections, read these letters which then have little hooks in them which suggest that you might go somewhere else. The British Museum Archive, the Central Archive, there are 3 archives in the British Museum. They don't talk to each other, they don't like each other. They quite like to know what's in the other archive if you find out. It's a nightmare working on Egypt because Egypt changed from one archive to another in 1973. So half of it's here, half of it's there, and no one quite knows what they have. If you go to the British Museum and say I'm working on mummy curses, they say not you again and show you the door. Whereas if you that's actually changed now. But if you go in and just say I'm working on an associate of the Egyptian keeper from 1893, they let you in. And then you tell them you're working on mummy curses because you find enormous envelopes full of stuff with material which is addressed mummy curses. Really? Is that in our archive? How did you find that? Where did you find that? And volumes and volumes and volumes of correspondence that's uncatalogued, for example, that more or less have 30 letters from Thomas Douglas Murray in, which they invited me to read at the top of a spiral staircase looking down three floors below. That was a joke from the archivist, making sure if I would, if I really was cursed. So there were material there, and that led me then to a note that just says you should really come along to our Ghost Club and talk about your cursed mummy artifact. Ghost Club, that rings a bell. 5,000 pages of minutes from the Ghost Club in the British Museum manuscript section, which again opens up all kinds of extraordinary materials. So you can kind of work through this. And the other thing I discovered about archives is how often they are accidentally catalogued. I began to think about this as a project which was about what isn't digitised, what hasn't yet been digitised, or what never was digitised. Don't broadcast it too far, but the Victoria and Albert Museum has a mummy somewhere, but they've lost it. So in the transfer between, they had loads and loads of artefacts in their collection, which they transferred to the British Museum in 1973, but on the way, one went missing, or one is still in their archive, I'm not quite sure where. And again, with the Welcome, which has lots and lots of strange things in its archive, I was asked if I to do one of their series called The Thing Is, where you pick an object from their archive and talk about it. So they have 3 mummified artefacts. Didn't really want to talk about the mummified child. That felt a bit freakish, because you pull that out of the archive and you talk with it, at it, with images. That sounded a bit creepy, but they had 2 mummified cats. And the first one, unbelievably, they came back and said, that is a phantom cat. It's a phantom in the archive. We don't think it ever was here. It's a sort of weird mistake. Okay, I'll go to the other cat. And it turned out the other cat was a biohazard, which they couldn't allow to the building because it was rotting. Okay, I'll choose a book then. So that's a sense of things not being, quite complete. So I think the thing is there are loads and loads of routes into the archive. And to think about it as something that isn't complete, isn't digitised, we haven't got there. All of the archivists who came to Birkbeck a couple of weeks ago were basically appealing for people like you to apply for funds to get into their archive to help them catalogue. So it's seen as a mutual kind of thing. That if there are people who are interested in the area, they come along. So Kew Gardens archivist have their miscellaneous collection. No one goes to because it sounds really boring. Uncatalogued and yet full of fantastic stuff. She was very persuasive about the extraordinary stuff you could find in there. But they need kind of people to come along to complete it, as it were, to close the loop. And that's the same with the archivists say at the Salvation Army and so on. And Birkbeck are working with them to try and pull that in. So I think there are lots and lots of possibilities there. The other thing is to say that I think attitudes in archives change, and that's also something that perhaps contemporary people researching contemporary can still think about going into those sorts of archives and doing. So, the example again from the Mummiker stuff was that when I started, you have to be very careful with archivists and to sort of be as sober and while I'm working on superstition, blah blah blah, in this. And you talk to the Petrie Museum just around the corner in UCL, which has 80,000 Egyptian artifacts. Do you have any cursed artifacts? And they don't just roll their eyes and just say, no, but someone comes in every day saying, I'm the reincarnation of X, can I have all my artifact back? And now, 10 years on, because the public impact agenda and so on, all that sort of stuff has come in, the public-facing curators are really interested in using those narratives to try and hook people in. This is, after all, what people are interested in. And rather than curators thinking that they should educate people out of this ridiculous stuff, as they use it as the hook to pull people in. So the eventual time, 10 years on, is last month giving a lecture at British Museum. So finally inside the kind of the central archive, they are looking at these kind of topics, and that is a really major shift, I think, of attitude. But again, you bring along contemporary issues, particularly perhaps around identity politics and so on. Ask a gendered question of an archive that hasn't been asked before, Salvation Army stuff, and what precisely mothers or Bernardo's archive, what precisely are you doing with these children, or you ask the race question or ethnicity questions and so on, and that opens up the archive in a brand new kind of way. And that, of course, means that an archive isn't stable, but is constantly shifting and will shift and will change according to the kind of questions that you ask it. I suppose what I'm trying to encourage is a way of getting out of a sense of the immediacy of working in contemporary culture. So that sense that you have to be up close, immediately inside it, without mediation. What really matters, I think, in contemporary researching contemporary is perspective of some kind, getting distance in some kind of way on contemporary. And that's an issue that I think means that we crack open the contemporary in different kind of ways. The most symbolic moment for me when I just got to Birkbeck 20 or so years ago, my first proper job. The English department used to be just around the corner from Senate House, and I would come in here in a blind panic to the library thinking, I've got to read this book to lecture it tomorrow. And there was in my first term, there was a very, very symbolic moment when I came into the main entrance of Senate House, and there was just a sign on the wall that just said, Emmanuel Levinas this way, with an arrow pointing to the left. And it was indeed Emmanuel Levinas. He was there in his last year of his life, I think, giving a lecture. And I had to turn the other way to go and do some preparation, to go and do some work, and I didn't go the Emmanuel Levinas way. And the next time I looked up, because you know what it's like, Zara knows what it's like in your first year of job, you don't see the real world at all, you're just kind of really working hard. But the next time I looked up, the Emmanuel Levinas wave had gone. That sort of moment of flowering about, this is the latest theories, you must know everything about Emmanuel Levinas. All of the translations came out that year, all of the secondary reading, secondary books, introductions to Levinas and contemporary novel, ethics and Levinas, all of that had peaked and gone before I'd kind of looked around again. I just thought, fashion. I understand this now. I understand the kind of the sense of it. If you actually are forced to step back from this, you don't necessarily have to ride that wave kind of all the time. And that was quite a sort of valuable lesson. It's not to say that Emmanuel Levinas is purely fashionable. It's not, but that sort of sense of this is the latest thing you must kind of latch onto. I backed away from it a little bit. So we, in the modern MA that I teach, which has a course on post-1945 literature to the present day, and we now have a whole contemporary MA that kind of grew out of that. What we used to teach right at the end of it was a thing, before Zizek got hold of this brilliant title, was the parallax view. So that sense right at the end, if you're going to work on the contemporary, what you need is a kind of parallax view. You need a perspective to get some kind of grasp on the contemporary, to not be in it, but to get some perspective on it. So the three injunctions really I would have is, if you're working on contemporary culture in whatever field you happen to be in, change genre. Think about changing genre. Just look at it from a different kind of perspective somewhere. That's quite often an injunction to my contemporary literature students particularly, because contemporary literature, literary fiction, is an incredibly narrow field, but one that nevertheless has an enormous kind of cultural dominance. And if you stay inside that tiny, Booker Prize genre of fiction, you get a really distorted view of things. And you actually pay attention to ridiculous statements about the death of the novel by Will Self. He's just replaced, not to name is saying that 15 years ago, he's just replaced, etc., etc. That sort of sense of crisis and so on. If you just step outside a genre and look at it from a different perspective, something else is going on, something very different is going on in crime fiction, in science fiction, in the gothic, in the weird, whatever that is, the new weird, and so on. So I think change genre is really important, and that gets you out of a kind of immediate lack of perspective. The other thing is to change discipline, I think, as well, to think about reading outside of discipline and making sure you do that. Now, I think that's much easier for the generation coming through than it was. But it's very striking to me, I think personally, that history of art or studies around art are much more attuned to the problem of the contemporary than, say, literature is. So there's loads of material on contemporary, what is contemporary art, Terry Smith, which I just read a book called When Was Contemporary Art? There's a book by Stephen Press called What is Contemporary Art, which has loads of really interesting things in it. They're very, very attuned to the problem of the contemporary, which in a way I think it has not been there in literary studies necessarily. You might disagree, actually. Personally, I tend to think that's a problem with postmodernism, which was, the dreaded P word was a thing that kind of was the dominant way of thinking about the contemporary literature and cultural theory for a long time, and hasn't quite recovered from that weird turn that we took into that. So I think changing discipline is quite important. And again, if you look at someone like Marc Auger's work on the anthropology of contemporaneity, and so on, lots of people nods there, which is good. But Auger's stuff I think is very interesting for this, and suggests a whole new kind of array. So I think changing discipline is helpful, or changing your perspective on things. The other thing I would encourage is change historical period as well. Think about different kinds of periodization. Now I did a PhD on J.G. Bard and rapidly realised in the early 90s I wasn't going to get a job with that, so tried to pretend to be a 19th century person instead, which was more helpful. And nevertheless, that sort of sense of looking at the fin de siècle, the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s kind of culture, was incredibly valuable actually for getting perspective on the contemporary stuff. I mean, you can nearly always guarantee that if you are having a debate about contemporary technology, the transformative changes of the internet, the transformative changes of digitalization, etc., it will have been done before. So, you can read Grant Allen on the absolute fracturing of the attention of psychology of the self in the 1880s. The fact that we are completely overloaded with information. I get 6 telegrams a day. I'm travelling up to London at over 10 miles an hour. Doesn't happen anymore. That sort of sense of complete overload. If I have to read 6 evening newspapers, I can't cope with this kind of information. We're degenerating. We're beginning to collapse because of this. All of this stuff is tied directly to technological history. It happens again and again and again. And that sort of perspective, I think, does really help. It also means that it is worth listening to people around you, colleagues, other researchers from totally different periods as well. It's worth going to a Renaissance seminar or to an 18th century seminar just to get an entirely different perspective. the worst thing you can do is say we have unique problems researching contemporary because of Zopa, etc., etc. That's why closed groups of Victorianists laugh at contemporary culture and their issues, because they've seen it all before, and this is nearly what they always say. So I think it's really important to kind of split that open. I mean, some of the resources I think about thinking about this, about the contemporary as something which is not immediate but mediated and full of different temporalities, different histories, and so on. I edited a book 15 years ago called Literature in the Contemporary, which has a fantastic essay by Steve Connor called From the Contemporary to the Contemporary. And it's an essay that is about how we need to think about the contemporary as the contemporary, that is times together, that the history and different temporalities are constantly streaming through the present, that the present, if it's possible, in its immediacy, but because it's actually fractured by all these other times. And in a way, that was a very kind of dominant way of thinking about breaking open the contemporary at that time. So you might think about, Agamben said this in a much worse way in his short and hopeless essay called What is the Contemporary? Which is that you need to think about the archaic alongside the immediate, that the contemporary is the one precisely who is untimely, and so on. And actually all of that, I think, also is done by Derrida and Status and Marx, again, about 20 years ago now. I remember going to a seminar which was reporting on Derrida has just delivered this series of 5 lectures in Riverside called Perspectives of Marx. It was a very, very important occasion. He was going to confront Marx, but finally this confrontation was going to happen. It was all very exciting. And he wrote Perspectives of Marx, less exciting. But that's the sense of the hauntology of the present, of something that is constantly kind of haunted. Let me just give, I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to give another example of this, and a really concrete example of the problem of researching in contemporary, I suppose, and that's the stuff that I've done on fictions of the Iraq War. The question that I had, so I wrote a book on trauma studies, and I was very aware, that came out in 2008, but I was very aware that actually the thing that I wasn't dealing with in that book, because I couldn't, because it was too contemporaneous with the writing, was issues about the Iraq War and so on. So I've been kind of trying to deal with that since. But one of the real questions in around 2008, 2009 was that where is the key book on the Iraq War? Where is the key literary response to this? If you think about the Vietnam War, right at the height of it, someone like Norman Mailer wrote Why Are We in Vietnam? Or other books coming out like If I Should Die, etc., etc. Loads and loads of kind of immediate fictional responses to it. Where's the Iraq War novel? Why is it not emerging? And is it something to do? 9/11 definitely had its kind of corpus, so it was kind of, it was coming out. We were kind of expecting John DeLillo to write a book on the Iraq War, and there it came. We quivered with fear that Martin Amis was bound to write something, and indeed he did. So that's what we were expecting this, and there's a canon there already of 9/11 novels, the submission, and those sorts of things. So it was beginning to emerge. I think that's something to do with it being, of course, 9/11 being a punctual event, so something that was designed to have an aftermath, designed to be thought about and punctual. Whereas, what was the Iraq War? Is it a war? Is it, where did it begin? Where did it end? Has it ended? In 2008 and 2009 it hadn't. Where is it ending? Obama announced it was ending in 2010. It didn't. He ended it in 2011. It hasn't ended. That sort of stuff is still going on. And within the last 3 months, the Iraq War was changed again, totally transformed again. So how do you deal with that? I was giving papers on this initially in 2008, 2009, and I famously went to Ghent to give a talk about this on the first few Iraq War novels, only to discover a blog on the train that listed 43 Iraq War novels that had come out, and perhaps this was beginning to suggest that the literature wasn't the kind of cultural central device for this after all. That these were coming out in independent journals and independent publishers, self-published. No one's read Tony Christie's Homefront, for example, because he self-published it. Maybe actually the route through here is blogs, is online poetry, the immediate kind of stuff, vlogs that have been written by soldiers. Sorry, we've done stuff recently. So these were the common routes. Maybe actually documentary is the route for this, the long narrative form, the brilliant kind of documentary forms that were coming out of that. I published an essay in 2012, and again, it felt very, very uncontemporary by the time it came out. So by this time, people had noticed that, oh yeah, Iraqis are writing as well. Maybe we should translate some of that. Finally, that sort of diaspora was beginning to respond to this as well. So I had a second version of it has just come out, but also feels incredibly contemporary now. But at least it has people like Hassim Basim, who got the Foreign Fiction Prize this year for The Iraqi Christ, or Sinan Antoun's book, The Corpse Washer, which is probably the best novel about contemporary Iraq war from an Iraqi exile anyway, but written by him in English, or translated by himself in English in 2014. So there were kind of elements about that. But what I began to realise was that rather than announce the death of the novel, which several people have because of the Iraq war, someone like David Shields in Reality Hunger, or Jeff Dyer, our guest of Birkbeck last Friday, had said, well, the documentary form is clearly much better, and actually the novel isn't the way of dealing with this issue. What I realised was, I think, that people were dealing with it, but precisely in this contemporary way. So that actually the best novels about the Iraq War don't mention the Iraq War at all, because they're dealing with prior wars, as it were. So Dennis Johnson's Tree of Smoke, which is 1959 to 1968, and every chapter is titled with a date, so you know exactly where you are. But it's about the end of Indochine, the French colonial wars, where the CIA came in, and that's the beginning of the Vietnam War. And it's all about the failure of intelligence in the beginning of the Vietnam War, why the Vietnam War happened, and clearly a meditation on the origins of the failure of intelligence in the 21st century, which resulted in another war. So it's a kind of, in other words, it's a genealogical thing, without ever mentioning the Iraq War at all. And again, one of the books that came out last year that I think is really interesting, probably one of the strongest things in the Iraq War, is Richard House's Kills. Anyone read that? It's 1,000 pages, 4 novels, one. It's all about aftermath, all about the officials and the corruption and the sweet deals from mercenaries and agencies, and never a single depiction of the war itself directly, but all about aftermath, as it were. And in that way, I think there is a sort of sense in which the fiction itself is designed to think contemporarily, to think about this in a sort of displaced way from a parallax kind of view. You can't be in it, but you have to think about this outside itself. And then just one final comment, if you're working on contemporary, which is the importance of auto-critique. And the great sort of model of this is Foucault, I think, who was always, would go into those phases, write those brilliant books, and then write, that was all wrong, consistently. He would kind of rehearse and rethink and readjust. So, from archaeology to genealogy to technology to the self, that's sort of brilliant auto-critique. The last thing I read for thinking about this seminar was an essay by Pedro Urba called Contemporaneity and His Discontents, which is in Diacritics from last year. And what he takes aim at is precisely everything I just said, which is that the problem with contemporary theory or contemporary theorists or people thinking about contemporary is that they're constantly trying to escape from being in the contemporary. And he takes aim at Gambon's essay, which is the contemporary, quite rightly because it's rubbish, but is kind of saying that there's a process of denial going on here about contemporaneity. And he suggests that actually what's being denied is a kind of confrontation with the global, with globalisation, with the end, as it were, of Western dominance, and then needing to think about contemporanisation of diversity, as he calls it. And that this is what's being displaced. This is the anxiety that people like Gavin are beginning to articulate, is that actually their thought, their models are precisely the ones that are beginning to be displaced. And that's where the denial comes from. So I read that 2 days ago. I'm still thinking about that. But I think, again, this is a process of thinking, okay, so we need to fold this back, think again, critique precisely what that position is. Am I in the same location, actually, as someone like Agamben and Derrida caught in this morning of melancholia about a certain kind of end? And actually, the contemporary is always, changing and altering, and that's what we should always. I'll stop there. Just opening it out to any questions, observations that you want to make.
I just say quickly, thanks for a great talk. Just to remind people about Colin Haminsky, the librarian here, who's coming to talk after this. He's going to pick up some of the stuff you mentioned, especially ideas of digitisation, accessing databases. And the thing I always get confused about the difference between natural language control and vocabulary when doing using digital indexing. So there's a kind of practical follow-up to stuff on here. And I just wanted to add, just because I'm kind of a masochist and I run an just reading group, that what you said about Angelo Carter is obviously the case now with David Foster Wallace, because there's clearly, we've got some people coming here working with Foster Wallace and postmodernism as well. But the idea that when someone dies, there's a kind of responsibility that's conferred on them. But if we'll open it out, just anyone wants to ask any questions.
Yeah, they don't have to be fully formulated questions at all. It just be observations or ties to your own work or anything that you want to kind of
I was thinking, well, you put this point when you did the last list in the talk, but the thing about things repeating, because of the technology argument, and yes, of course you can talk to a 19th century scholar in code just because of something that happened in print, but it's not the same.
Yeah.
And one of the useful things about that is when someone comes back to you and says, the fact you're getting in about what's happened in this contemporary instance happened before. That's actually a challenge to think, okay, well, what's unique about what's happening in this? So as a researcher, it's the thing where you go, okay, I've got to work a bit harder. I can't just repeat a kind of inane comment about, everyone kind of being born with attention deficit sort of because we're overwhelmed. That doesn't do anything. But there is something that's happening now, and what's that? And what is it to be surrounded by code, and what's issues of control that is always going to be different from kind of previous communication technology. But then you did the flip. So that would have been a discontent.
Yeah, no, I think that is right. And there is a challenge there, because I think someone can then always. I mean, the really obviously dialogic thing here in my School of Arts at Birkbeck is that we have lots of people working on that sort of end of it, so contemporary stuff, but it's key in dialogical relationship with material book. People who are Renaissance and 18th century scholars who are working on the beginnings of that sort of print technology and the crisis. Someone like Jill Partington's work, which is around the crisis in print, around the origin of the novel and truth, falsity kind of things. And Jill did a PhD on the crisis of authority, truth, etc. in the early internet, as it were, the rise of conspiracy theories, and the fact that you can't filter these sorts of sites anymore, that the expertise has been kind of fractured in a different kind of way. So I think there's really kind of obvious kind of dialogical continuities with people, but at the same time, it is worth saying that the access of information, the kind of quantity of information is, I think, is definitely a novum.
But it's also a language thing, like when you think about that material texting, you should be talking with sort of many lists or other scholars and kind of most material text networks involve people working kind of right throughout sort of print or manuscript, but you can't talk about the object of text in exactly the same way in both instances, or you alight something.
Yeah.
You kind of don't do it justice.
Yeah.
And that actually is the historical, or the parallel actually that gives you some friction. That is the interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just that, say, medievalists had a different kind of problem, a different kind of way of surfing. They do surf material text. My colleague Anthony Bale is working on medieval Jerusalem. Took 10 months to get into an archive in Jerusalem to look at a particular manuscript archive. And he went to it and opened this document, which had a slip from 1929 that just said, "It's not here, it's in Rome." So in a way that, so for people doing this, okay, so I go to another site and then go here. Anthony has to get on a plane and go to that, but it's a similar sort of trail, as it were. It's a physical material trail of text, but it's a similar sort of thing. Just more glamorous.
Now, just to pick up on that, I take your point about how do you put it, change period, and what Zara was saying as well. There is an aspect of that gets quite tiresome when you see, you come across early modernists who says, modern life starts here, or 19th century person who says the modern world starts here, and kind of stuff like that. I mean, I was interested in trying to link that back to ideas of genre, thinking about, say, neo-Victorian novels or steampunk, and that's obviously that's kind of an object of study that both Victorianists and contemporaries all kind of go to. But I do have a kind of a specific, I guess, problematic to raise. I take your point about the kind of, the fantasy, the total archive, it's X-Files or Warehouse 13, that raises the law, so everything's kind of there, and the idea that all archives are kind of open in that way. The archives you mentioned all seem to be kind of official. I mean, I'm interested really in comics and graphic novels, and while comic studies have developed over the period that I've done my PhD, it's clear that archives in this country certainly haven't developed. Because so many underground comics are still, they're self-published or published by small press. Archives are often in private hands. There are archives that are slowly being developed, Chris Murray and Dundee, but they're massively dispersed. I mean, and I know I have a colleague, Nicola Streeton, at Sussex, who just started specifically to research small press comics, so that would perform kind of a valuable function. But I wondered how, if you've encountered this problem, that that the archive, it's not an archive, it's just dispersed. You basically have to construct your own kind of thing.
Yeah, very specifically, I think, because it's still the case that, if you're thinking about popular culture, this is the problem, right? And that's about the change of attitude, which comes too late for official archives like, say, the British Library. You might change your attitude about these kind of things, but you don't have the resources to do that. And you might notice when the British Library did their science fiction show last year, quite a lot of the material they had was just Mark Private Collection or John Clute's private collection. And John Clute is a famous private collector. You can go and look at his archive, which is undercounted the market. He's got enormous kind of just vaults of stuff. He's going to contribute it to not a British university, but South Florida University when he dies. And that has been a real problem with that, and it remains a real problem. So when I was working on Lovecraft, again, pulp fiction stuff, so weird tales, very few archives contain a complete run of weird tales. The largest collection of science fiction in the world is at Riverside, which doesn't have 1923 to 1926 of weird tales. You want to buy a copy of Weird Tales from that period, it's £15,000 each. They're in private hands, contested private hands as well. So some researchers will like what you do, some might not, and won't give you access to them. Yeah, so there is a kind of issue around that when that changes, and Gothic stuff, very obscure horror writers, private hand collections again. It's all about personal networks and personal connections. There's a different kind of value. There's a value now, I think, in things that precisely aren't available, that aren't digitised, that aren't accessible. They accrue all kinds of value in all kinds of interesting ways. Alistair Crowley's stuff around the corner in the Warburg Institute, just about to go out of copyright, 60 years I think since he died. You know, what happens with that kind of material? What kind of groups, what kind of struggles are there between his various mad descendants? So there are kind of issues around that, and that becomes a real problem about how then you begin to build those archives back up. And particularly now with a kind of chronic underfunding, it seems to me that no library can afford the space for that sort of just sense of, well, what we need is, we need a collection, we need a comics collection, so let's just buy one in. You know, the library's upstairs, 20% of the space being
I should add that there's someone here from the I realise there is the Rackov collection.
Can't believe I'm money.
Which is it was a personal collection of someone hand over. I think that might be part of the problem. I know Chris Murray he doesn't even have money to do that. He's basically contacting, being a comic studies, we touched on the actor fan or scholar fan, he's basically asking for contributions, but the downside of that is that it's obviously very haphazard, and there's going to end up being massive gaps.
That's right. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So it needs. I mean, it really needs. A consistent, logical kind of collecting mentality. And actually, someone like John Clute, who's just has, I think, private. Just has always had private wealth to be able to do that, and also therefore the space to do that. But no university library, except one or two in the world, were ever interested in that until quite late, until quite recently. I would have thought that it was an issue for a very long time, say with someone like J.G. Ballard, no interest in him actually until, as it were, too late. But then fortunately he donates it to the British Library rather than it being put up for sale where it would have gone to America. So there are kind of really strong cases around particularly popular culture, which just an attitude change, and suddenly you need an archive that is no longer
unpopular culture. So
it's really interesting. I've got, I suppose, 2 points to make. Neither of them related to my thesis research because I have a lot of interest to the side. One of which is J.G. Ballard. I think Ballard's really interesting. He has a really interesting conceptual idea. I think you probably have obviously read about his, and probably written as well because I've read your book about invisible literatures. And there's a sense in which Ballard is kind of thinking around these unofficial literatures before we have this problem, what you're talking about, sort of cultural shifting attitudes, and all of a sudden certain things that sort of lie outside the canon become interesting. And he, in a lot of interview material, refers to the fact that he's a voracious reader of invisible literatures, things what he calls sort of advertising copy, journal articles, sort of memorandum, just odd bits of ephemera that he said, he described as the most potent compost of the imagination, which unfortunately is where a lot of his stuff ended up, is probably compost now. It was never saved. So one of my sort of side projects and interests, and something that seems quite relevant to the discussion that you've just been having, is to try and sort of start a list of invisible literatures, so talk about it in general terms, but also those references to things that Ballard would consider invisible literatures. There's some crossover because there's probably the stuff he had in his library, things like the Warren Commission report, which he calls invisible literature, but obviously is also physical and sort of enduring thing. So sort of try and make a list of these things, which it's not part of an official archive, but it sort of stands as a supplement to that, because I think a lot of people have approached this in different different ways, but nobody's kind of foregrounded that idea of invisible literature. So that's part of what I'm working on. The other thing is I work on digitising. Formerly, before being a PhD student, I was working at Leeds University Library, and I sort of because I'm personally interested in their science fiction periodicals, was trying to digitise at least the covers of a lot of copies of those as a publicity exercise. The problem with them is that they are actually disintegrated,
Yes,
because obviously they're also published on paper though. And it's a sad thing because they might not actually exist. So even trying to play catch up now, people have this stuff, but it is sort of degrading. It's sort of it's disintegrating anyway. So that's a difficulty as well. And there's not enough interest in it still. We've got ours because it was donated by a former chemistry lecturer at the university who was basically a fan. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean that's the issue in when you're working with, let's say, invisible or subcultural, I suppose you might say, areas, is that they literally disintegrate in front of your eyes. So I used to go to Colindale Library, the newspaper library of British Library, which is now moved, a shed at the end of the Northern Line, where ancient men would arrive with trolleys of stuff. And I was reading spiritualist journals from the 19th century, and at the end of the day, you would have a pile of paper at the bottom of your kind of reading desk, because they were disintegrating a pile of paper. And some of them were digitised and some of them weren't, so there's this real paradox of, as you read and recover this information, you are also destroying it. And the whole problem of scanning and digitising, of destroying books as you scan them, is important. And the simplest kind of task of getting hold of even photographs of weird tales, Lovecraft weird tales, was a global problem of trying to get someone to photograph them for me at various archives who did actually have bits and pieces. It's an enormous kind of problem. The other thing about invisible literature, of course, is that by definition, if you write a list, then you get a parallel list of things you're not listing. So there is always something that's falling outside of that.
yeah,
And then
there's a sort of contradiction there.
yeah, exactly. And then but it is precisely as you say about kind of personal collection. So an enormous collection of 19th century ephemera in Oxford Library in Bodleian, for example, which is used by people doing 19th century popular cultural studies. But that, of course, is a snapshot of someone's particular eccentricities. And the other parallel, I suppose, would be outside of art, which is itself a kind of collecting habit. And someone like the current exhibition at Hayward about folk art and outside of art. All of that stuff, I think, is the attention again of curators has shifted and say, okay, so this was outside, and now we are going to focus on this, and it becomes a very kind of it becomes the visible form of art, but it by its nature is dropping certain other stuff as well. So it becomes this sort of paradox of a moving target, which is a good thing, I think, because it means that your knowledge framework is constantly having to shift.
And certainly technology sort of enabled that a little bit.
Yeah.
So I envisage this invisible, making invisible sort of list to be an open framework thing, and to be basically just in its simplest form, a moderated web form, because there are, as you say, a lot of the research that's taken place on hard art up until fairly recently has actually been outside the academy as well. So it's just people that have a huge amount of knowledge that could sort of contribute. So it's sort of open in that sense.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I was kind of coming halfway through, so
No worries.
I just want to just do Mary, so this is Kieran, it's going to be doing like even.
Yeah, the question I wanted to ask really, just to follow on from what you were saying, what you were saying actually about archives and institutions. I wonder the extent to which institutions actually become less important now in archiving popular culture. Just because I've had colleagues who I work with in my field are involved in projects that they term archival activism, which basically is effectively kind of fan boys and girls donating things digitally to an online archive. So I called Jez Collins, I think called the Birmingham Music Archive, which effectively consists of people taking photographs of tickets that they kept from 35 years ago, and that kind of ephemera, and donating up to this online archive. So I wonder if that might be something that, whether formal institutions may be actually becoming less important given the kind of funding context that you talked about.
Sure.
But the main question I wanted to ask, just kind of preempt the talk that I'm going to give this evening, and that's I wanted to ask you, because I just know when I was listening to you talk about your work on the Iraq War and that kind of thing, I was wondering the extent to which politics is kind of present in your motivations for doing your research on contemporary culture. Because I'm a historian, I research the history of kind of cultural studies perhaps, and when I look at the history of cultural studies in the 1970s, politics is banned and slap banned in the middle of what the project was. So I wonder whether you or anyone else in the room has a perspective on where politics is in cultural studies now.
Oh, two very different questions. I think on the first one about digital archive, I think that's right. The other question then is about survivability of that kind of material, so the endurance of that kind of material. I mean, the irony of the British Film Institute archive is that all of that, we've just lost the last 35mm projector. All the stuff is now digitally projected, and they have, of course, a huge archive of film. But what they eventually do with everything is convert it into 35mm to preserve, because that's stable. It's a stable form. The analog form is the most stable form. And as we all know, there are formats from the 80s, encyclopedias that no one can now read because the hardware is no longer available. So there's a kind of sense of I think underneath this is that can feel quite ephemeral as a form of preservation, unless there is a kind of hardware stability underneath it somewhere that's kind of preserving that on servers and so on. And I don't think that's necessarily something that people just putting the stuff out there are necessarily always thinking through, but that is really important. So I think there is a kind of sense of yes, it's definitely changing, but there is a sort of anxiety about how long does it happen and in what ways are you preserving that. That's by definition digital ephemeral as well, whatever platform you're using. So I think there are issues in that. The other question about political stuff is I think it is very the motivation for the Iraq War stuff was always very profoundly political, I think, and a sense that I think one of the most effective pieces that I've seen in relation to that was Thomas Hirschhorn's incommensurable banner. I don't know if people know this, which is an 18-metre banner of basically the photographs that the press wouldn't publish of damaged, destroyed bodies. It's what smart bombs do to bodies, particularly focused on just really gruesome head wounds of children and things like this. And my frustration was that from literature and cultural theory stuff, there was a model about representation of traumatic stuff that was taken directly from the Holocaust stuff. So basically, you weren't allowed to do that. That was not modernist enough. You had to be indirect. You had to not use direct images. And I felt that actually it wasn't considering the political shift that you need. So it might well be the case that now in 2014 representations of the Holocaust need to think about indirection, or need to think about problematising straightforward representations. I'm not sure that they do, but with a current or contemporary war that's being so managed and controlled, it seems to me crucial that you have the most naive, direct, immediate kind of images. That has a direct political function. So I didn't necessarily have a problem with the endless attempts to try and portray, say, torture and so on in Hollywood films, however degraded or difficult or sickly liberal they were, because that was precisely not the thing that was being confronted. You felt that you had to. There was at least a kind of integrity intent, however problematic. So I think there was a kind of drive for that, but it's not necessarily one that comes from a particular, I'm of this Marxist-Leninist faction, and so on, because I don't think that's necessarily where I'm coming from, or cultural studies comes from, necessarily anymore, or not always. So I think there was a political intent to that project, and I still think that presumably is what drives many people in their kind of setting.
I just say, Jeremy Gilbert gave a talk last night, which touched on a lot of issues in cultural studies, cultural theory, cultural analysis, and the place of politics. He's going to be providing us with a text of this talk, which should be up online quite shortly. I think it's time for coffee. Maybe if we could all thank Roger for his talk.